Video games. With each passing day, they are becoming more and more popular, and with events like E3 pushing the latest releases, they are only brought further into the mainstream. Since we were kids, the franchises we grew up with, like Mario and Zelda, still excite people to this day. But while names like Mario and Zelda have become household names, other franchises are dominating the scene. Some of the most popular video game franchises have humble beginnings in old-school systems, and that is what we're counting down. Before we get to the list, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to get more content on the games you love. Metroid. So if we're talking about classic, long-standing video game franchises, we have to talk about Metroid, the franchise that is one half of the buzzword Metroidvania. Now, that word has been popping up a lot, and to younger people, they might be wondering what it means. Well, a Metroidvania game is a subgenre of action-adventure platformer where the player has to navigate an interconnected dungeon with secret rooms, discoverable paths, and relies on backtracking. This is important because the two franchises on this list, Metroid and Castlevania, created this subgenre. So where did this space pirate shooting bounty hunter come from? Samus's journey began way back in 1986 with the release of Metroid for the NES. Back then, the protagonist, Samus Aran, was a complete mystery. In fact, everyone assumed Samus was a man until the very end when she took off her power armor, and well, the rest is history. Samus Aran and the Metroid franchise has been a consistent powerhouse for Nintendo since the 80s. People fell in love with the mini GBA and NES games until she made the leap into the 3D world with Metroid Prime for the GameCube back in 2002. Then, during E3, fans were surprised with the teaser for Metroid Prime 4 after 10 years of waiting for a new game. Castlevania. After talking about Metroid, it only makes sense that we talk about the Vania in Metroidvania. The Castlevania series has been popping up in popularity now due to Netflix announcing an anime adaptation of the beloved franchise that will be airing this July. And before that, we should take a look at Castlevania's beginnings. In fact, despite the most recent titles released back in 2014, old-school gamers still remember the classic 1987 game fondly. Like Metroid, Castlevania was a 2D action-adventure platformer where the main character, Simon Belmont, had to traverse an interconnected dungeon with secret passageways and discoverable areas. The only difference is that instead of an alien planet, you were traversing Dracula's castle, and instead of blasting Metroids, you were whipping the minions of the undead. Before coming to America, Castlevania went through a name change. It was known in Japan as Akumajo Dracula, or Demon Castle Dracula. When it was released in Japan, the game was featured on the Famicom disk system. What sets Castlevania apart from its mechanical sister Metroid was that Simon was noticeably slower at maneuvering than the acrobatic Samus. Nevertheless, Castlevania is immortalized in the history of gaming and has influenced an entire subgenre of games like Ori and the Blind Forest and the recently released Hollow Knight. Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, was a rousing success, but the story of the game's protagonist, Snake, goes back to the 2D era. The year was 1987, and Hideo Kojima debuted with Konami with a top-down 2D shooter featuring a hardened mercenary named Snake. While the game looked like typical 2D shooters, Kojima had an idea about how to change all this. Instead of this soldier going in guns blazing, what if the object of the game was to avoid confrontation? Guards would patrol each screen in a set pattern, and it was up to the player to figure out the pattern and sneak past undetected, taking them out without the other guards noticing. This game, only known as Metal Gear at the time, would help revolutionize the stealth action genre of games. With each new installment in the series, the player would have more and more options at their disposal. From the 2D top-down shooter to a sprawling 3D open world, the world and story of Metal Gear has only grown with time. Hey guys, we're excited to announce the Premium Network. The Premium gets you early access to videos from The Richest, Screen Rant, The Taco, The Sportster, The Things, and many other great channels. Literally thousands of videos in one place, with an ad-free browsing experience. Check out the Premium by clicking on this link. Sign up for free and start binge-watching videos from your favorite channels. Fire Emblem. This franchise may not be as well known as the others mentioned here, but Fire Emblem has recently been making a climb in popularity with the recent release of Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia. Fire Emblem, for those who don't know, is a turn-based strategy game where you move your units to defeat the enemy units. The game is simple to learn but difficult to master, as each unit has its own stats, equipment, special abilities, and levels. It can be pretty difficult, but is strangely addicting. With the release of Shadows of Valentia and the recent release of Fire Emblem Heroes, players are being exposed exposed to this, for the most part, relatively obscure franchise. The reason for that being, for the most part, Fire Emblem games were a Japan-exclusive title. The first game in the FE franchise came out for Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1990, and it was called Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light. Players overseas would not see the game for over 20 years, until the remake came for the DS, when it was simply named Fire Emblem. However, it all changed when Fire Emblem Awakening exploded onto the 3DS, and since then the franchise has seen a healthy growth of players on the 3DS. Ninja Gaiden. With today's games, you would be hard-pressed to find a more established ninja franchise than the Ninja Gaiden franchise, and for good reason. The Ninja Gaiden games have been notorious for their difficulty. We're talking about a game on Dark Souls level difficulty, with Yeba, Ninja Gaiden Z, being released in 2014. This marks the 16th game in the franchise. To see where it began, we have to go back, you guessed it, the 1980s. The first Ninja Gaiden game was released in arcades in 1988. You played as Ryu Hayabusa, a ninja who fights in the streets of America to get back to his throne in Japan. Gamers young and old at the time were met with continue screen after continue screen, eating away a week's worth of quarters in a single sitting. A port for the NES was released in December of that year, and did not let up on the difficulty. Only this time, you didn't need to feed quarters into the game to continue. Today there is no word of a new Ninja Gaiden game from E3, but with the popularity of some of its contemporaries, like Nioh, we are sure to see the famous Shinobi rise back to the top. GTA. No video game franchise has gotten more press for its gratuitous depictions of violence than Grand Theft Auto. The game landed the entire gaming community in the center of a massive controversy way back when, and some would still say it causes controversy now, from the hot coffee controversy to the big video games cause violence argument. However, this franchise is still going strong after all these years. Now when people think of classic GTA, they mostly think of Vice City, and for good reason. Many fans still see it as the most memorable game of the franchise. However, the franchise began back in the 90s for DOS. The content of the game was far tamer than what the franchise would eventually evolve into, but that's not to say GTA didn't turn some heads back in 97. In the game, there were NPCs known as Hare Krishnas, who were pedestrians that walked in a line and all had traditional orange Hare Krishna clothing. If the player managed to mow down an entire row with their car, a flashing Garanga would flash on the screen, which meant be happy. Fallout. One of Bethesda's powerhouse franchises, the Fallout series has seen an explosion of popularity with the amazing success of Fallout 3, New Vegas, and Fallout 4. But the story of Fallout is a long one. Too long, in fact, for one spot in this video. So let's start right where Fallout was released. The first game was released on PC in September of 1997. Fallout was born from a previous post-apocalyptic game called Wasteland, which came out in 1988. This was before Bethesda even came into the picture. In fact, the people who published the game were Electronic Arts, better known as EA today. Wasteland tells the story of 4 rangers surveying the southwest deserts after a US-Russia nuclear exchange, a theme that is prevalent throughout the franchise. The original creators of Wasteland, who would go on to make Fallout, wanted to make an RPG like no other at the time, and they accomplished this firstly by making it a non-fantasy RPG. Eventually, Wasteland would go on to be an isometric 3D role-playing game known as Fallout, and from there it would evolve into a staple for Bethesda games to be enjoyed by millions of gamers in a thriving community. XCOM. Not all franchises have a steady rise to the top. Some struggle along the way, with games that either disappoint fans or miss the mark entirely. This is the case with the XCOM series, which is in the middle of what many would call a renaissance of the franchise. It all started back in 1994 with XCOM UFO Defense, or as it was called in the UK, UFO Enemy Unknown. It was released for Microsoft DOS and then ported to the PlayStation 1 in 1995. The game was a sleeper hit, and soon it amassed a following that helped shape the future of other franchises like Diablo and Freedom Force. In later years, there would be reskins and sequels on the MS-DOS, but the XCOM franchise would hit a snag with the sequel XCOM Apocalypse, which was ambitious at the time with features like plausible real-time gameplay, but it was perceived as a mess compared to the first game. Throughout the 21-year lifespan of the franchise, XCOM has seen up and downs, but fans were overwhelmed when XCOM 2 Enemy Unknown dropped in 2015. The game is still popular today thanks to an active modding community and a fan base that is glad that their game is on the upswing of its life. Elder Scrolls. Who hasn't played Skyrim at this point? Bethesda's other powerhouse franchise, set in the epic fantasy world of Tamriel, has been getting a lot of mileage as of late. At E3, Nintendo showcased how you can play Skyrim on the Switch, and even Sony has announced that you can play Skyrim in VR. Not to mention that Elder Scrolls Online just released their latest expansion, Morrowind, which was a callback to an earlier game in the franchise. Of course, like Fallout, Elder Scrolls has come a long way. It all began in '94 with Elder Scrolls Arena. Even back then, the series went through some changes before it was released. Arena's original idea was to have a team of gladiators compete in turn-based battles, but that quickly turned into a game with sprawling side quests, big cities, and soon evolved into the franchise we know today. What Arena gave to the genre of fantasy RPG video games was a huge overworld that has yet to be matched by any of the following games. In the game, players could travel across the whole continent of Tamriel, which include the titles of later games like Morrowind and Skyrim. Today, Elder Scrolls is known to all as a massive fantasy RPG, with a larger-than-life world for players to explore. Red Dead. Never before in gaming has a single image caused so many players to rejoice. When Rockstar unveiled a single teaser image for Red Dead Redemption 2, the series has seen a lot of love over the years, but few people remember the origins of this game, mostly because it was reinvented from the ground up from its original version. Red Dead Redemption came from the Red Dead Revolver game, developed by Rockstar in 2004. It was influenced by Capcom's 1985 arcade game, Gunsmoke, where the player was put into the dusty environment of the old American West, home to tumbleweeds, gunslingers, and bounty hunters. In Revolver, you played as the stoic bounty hunter Red Harlow, who seeks vengeance after his parents were murdered years before. The game was generally well received, but didn't get nearly as much attention as its spiritual successor. In 2010, Rockstar launched Red Dead Redemption, and well, the rest is history. 8 characters were released as DLC later in the game, including Red Harlow himself. While RDR was softer on the arcade style, over-the-top action, it did keep the unique dead-eye aiming mechanic. Red Dead Redemption 2 is slated to come out in 2018, and we here at The Gamer are just excited as you guys are. There you have it. Those are our 10 modern video game franchises that had older versions. Have you played any of the games on the list? How did you like them? If you have a fun old game to share, let us know in the comments. And while you're at it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can see more amazing videos on the games you love. Don't forget to check out our playlist, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on The Gamer.